Your name and the title of your book.
My name is Steve Eisenbraun, and the title of my book, right here, Danger and Romance in Foreign Lands.
Okay, and Stephen, can you tell us something about yourself?
Well, I have spent most of my adult life in the State Department in Washington, which sent me on foreign assignments to various embassies in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Kenya, and elsewhere. And in that capacity, I had a lot of exciting experiences. So I created a novel with a character who is a foreign correspondent. But at the beginning of the novel, the part that takes place in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, the character is me, essentially. Although it's a novel, it's not a travelogue, it's not a political memoir. But then the book goes on. It goes on into Kenya, and then it continues on. The venue is in London, and that is more fictional. I never had an assignment in London, although I know the city well.
So how many books have you written?
I have written 3, and this is the only novel, the first published novel. The other 2 were collections of short stories.
And out of those 3 books, which one is your favorite?
Well, I think that this novel is because it's the one that encompassed so much of my personal life.
And can you tell us what is the significance of danger and romance?
The title sums it up. The characters, both of them, it's the American journalist who began essentially as me, and the beautiful woman he met in New Delhi, who was a banker, Indian lady, by the way, he met in New Delhi. The 2 of them together encounter some truly dangerous situations, and that's the recounting of what happened to them along the way. At the beginning, the dangerous situations actually were real that I was involved with. Later, they were fictionalized and involved more of the girl, the American journalist, and the lady fall in love in India, and they eloped to Kenya. And they eloped because her parents, Indian parents, were opposed to their getting married. So they ran off anyway.
Okay. And in Danger and Romance, which are your favorite characters?
Oh, the girl, naturally.
If so,
and she's not a girl exactly. She's a fully adult woman, a banking executive in New Delhi, and then she continues that banking role in Nairobi and later in London at very senior level. And she takes over the novel, actually. And yes, I found her to be an intriguing character. And after a while, it seemed as though she was writing the novel. The novel was about her.
And can you tell us the inspiration for Danger and Romance?
It was all the great fun that I had and drama in my life. I had more experiences as a diplomat overseas than many of my colleagues did. It was just a function of where I was and when I was there. Now we're talking the mid-70s to the mid-80s. That's the time frame for this book. And so I was telling stories of my experience, although my imagination began to take over.
Thank you, Stephen. And what was the highlight of writing this book?
The highlight of writing it, it's called Danger and Romance. And one might think that the danger part would be the highlight, explaining terrible danger, such as the true story of the burning of the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad in 1979, which I know a lot about. But actually, you asked what was the most enjoyable part of writing? It was a love story. I found I had a certain facility in writing a love story, even though the love story is fictional. I was happily married, and so the story is fictional. Those who have read the book, my colleagues and a book critic, pointed out that the book is really a woman-friendly novel that talks about not just romance, but the real-life difficulties of cross-cultural romance and marriage. And so it kind of becomes a little more serious as the book progresses.
And you mentioned you have 3 books. Can you tell us about your first published book and what was the journey like?
Yes, the first published book was Love and Adventure. There's tales, collected tales of love and adventure. 28 short stories, all told in the first person, are all true, and they tell episodes in my life. Some of them are overseas, whether in Calcutta or in Bangkok or in Paris, but other ones are from my where I grew up in Iowa and where my family is from in South Dakota. So the venues, the settings for the stories are quite different, but each one of them illustrates something quite unusual, such as one day in the State Department, I was called and asked if I wanted to have lunch with the Vice President, George H.W. Bush, and I did. So that was an unusual event for anyone in the State Department. I'm not aware of any of my colleagues who have ever had that kind of experience. So I wrote it in the story.
Great. And which of your books were the most enjoyable to write?
Oh, I think this one, the novel, most enjoyable. And you know, it's 200 pages or so. I wrote it in 6 weeks. I wrote it in the summer of 2020 when we were all essentially in quarantine, you might say, and when the pandemic was at its worst. So I was out on my back porch. It was summertime, and I was sitting in my favorite rocking chair overlooking the lawn and the blooming roses. One would never know there was a pandemic going on, but I was more or less at home, and I had free time, and I just had my computer out there and wrote, and it was very pleasant.
Can you tell us about your first published book and what was the journey like?
The first published book was this one, if you can see it. It's called, was it Collected Tales of Love and Adventure. These are 28 first-person stories, all true, of adventures I have had, whether abroad in places like India, Pakistan, or in this country, Iowa, South Dakota, where I grew up in Iowa. And then I have a second one. I wrote 28 stories, and I just kept going. This was 2020 and 2021. So I wrote more. And this second edition, More Collected Tales, is a story similar, some stories from abroad. Most of them are ironic in nature. Something unusual happens that is not expected, and that usually is the end. And I just want to point out, can you, if the camera can see this little, that's my daughter, my youngest daughter, when she was about 2 years old. She's 21 now. And then the other has a picture of my son, the youngest son, David, who this picture is taken in Pakistan with his adopted Pakistani dog, which he brought back to the States. And then there's a story about the dog in here too. And several stories about my youngest son, and in this collection of my older son. I actually have 4 children. So it's personal stories, first person, and they were a lot of fun to write. Hardly any editing necessary, because they just wrote themselves.
Okay. And which of your books were the most enjoyable to write?
Well, I think I may have referred, it probably was the novel, Love and Danger and Romance, because it was more complex.
Now, what inspired you to start writing?
I was interested in telling a story from my past, and I just simply typed out what became the first chapter, I think one morning. It hardly took more than a couple of hours. And that was kind of fun, so then I wrote another chapter. It's not as though I had this entire novel sketched out and all the characters developed. It evolved, but it evolved just because it was an enjoyable, escapist type thing to do during a period when I was pretty much at home anyway during the pandemic.
And how long have you been writing?
Writing? Well, I've been writing fiction for 2 years. But I've been writing all of my life, if you consider all of the political analysis and reporting that I did in the Foreign Service and in Washington as well. Writing has been a feature of my life for almost 50 years, actually. But fiction, now that's new, and that's a lot of fun because I don't have any constraints. I can write whatever I want, and I don't have to follow any rules. The writing that one does in the State Department as a political officer generally has parameters, and one has to be very careful about not the content, but format, and here I don't have to have any worry about that. I can do whatever I want, and I have found that freedom to be very enjoyable, heady, actually. And I like just making it up. And so at the beginning, the story in the novel started being fairly close to my experiences. But as I kept writing, it deviated more and more and more. And I would say essentially the characters took over the story as they evolved, and they were doing things and saying things that seemed logical. And I think the characters started writing the story, especially the Indian lady.
And have you always wanted to be a writer?
Oh, yes, certainly. Words are something that come to me pretty naturally. I'm not so good in math, but I'm awfully good with words.
And Stephen, how do you handle literary criticism?
Well, the criticism I have gotten so far, I've appreciated. I've had some sections that a critic said were not so appropriate, let's say, for women, being maybe misogynistic, and I thought, well, I don't want that, and so I just simply deleted that material and took a different tack. I appreciated that criticism a great deal. Then another person said, well, you haven't developed the character of the Indian father, and that was very worthwhile criticism. So then I devoted pages to the father, and that was logical. So far I haven't had any vicious criticism. It's been constructive, and I've tried to incorporate the criticisms.
And what advice would you give a new writer, someone just starting out?
Well, actually, I had a phone conversation with someone very recently in that position, and she asked me the same question. And the answer was, well, you simply have to, it's loosely quoting what, Confucius, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. So you've got to put the piece of paper in the typewriter or create the Word document that you start with. You have to just type out the first sentence, and then maybe the second, and eventually they'll flow from there. But you have to get over the inertia of actually composing, and you don't have to do the whole thing in one fell swoop. It evolves.
Thank you. And where can readers purchase your book?
They're available at Barnes & Noble online, and they're available from Amazon online.
And where can readers find out more about you and your books?
You can go to my website. It's my full name, Stephen Eisenbraun with no spaces.com. That's my website, where there is information, some photos and information about my career in the State Department and a bit about my experiences in education.
And lastly, how's your experience working with Bookmark Alliance?
Been very friendly. Bookmark Alliance has some very friendly employees who have coaxed me along in my endeavors, the sales part of it, that is. I had already finished writing when I came to their attention, and they've encouraged me on the promotion side of the business. It's been very pleasant. Bookmark has a very enthusiastic group of and friendly group of employees.